During the times of the USSR, Ukraine was one of the founding countries of the United Nations. The Soviet Union was represented in the UN by Ukraine, Belarus, and directly by the whole USSR. There is already a contradiction in this sentence, which raises the following question: aren't Ukraine and Belarus part of the Soviet Union? Then why are they present in the UN separately? It would be just as strange if the states of Texas and Alaska were present in the UN besides the USA. You don't get into the UN just like that. To be a member of the United Nations, you have to be a state. And one of the attributes of statehood is its own Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It is this ministry that sends an application to join the organization. Of course, in the USSR there was only one foreign ministry, in Moscow. To solve this problem, in February 1944, Moscow adopts a law on granting the Union Republics powers in the field of foreign relations. Even the constitution is amended. And each republic establishes its own diplomatic service. Naturally, they do not conduct any activity at all. It's just an imitation for the sake of achieving political goals. Stalin wanted all 15 republics of the USSR to join the UN as separate states. To have additional votes there. Of course, that the US and UK were against it. Everyone understood perfectly well that the Soviet republics were not sovereign states and had no real rights. Any state within the US had more rights and independence than Ukraine within the Soviet Union. Soviet Commissar Mikoyan wrote in his memoirs that it was Stalin who turned the Soviet republics into powerless autonomies and forced them to get rid of their own codes of laws, bringing their legislation in line with Russian law. Now, Stalin's 15-member idea at the UN didn't work. Then he proposed to the Western Allies to admit Ukraine, Belarus and Lithuania to the UN separately. Now the argumentation was based on the law, on the formation of military formations of the Union republics. In order to imitate the presence of statehood, Ukraine is creating its own Ministry of Defense, which is headed by a Ukrainian, Vasyl Gerasimenko. Perhaps he takes this game at face value, because he even tries to organize some activity and makes working requests to Moscow. They remain unanswered. In 1945, Ukraine and Belarus become members of the UN. And the next year all these fake structures are liquidated. They have fulfilled their task and are no longer needed. The laws and amendments to the constitution adopted under this task existed until 1977, and were cancelled with the adoption of the so-called Brezhnev Constitution. Of course, they were not applied in any way. One day Petro Shelist, the leader of Soviet Ukraine, tried to use this legislative framework, and raised the issue with Moscow that Ukraine wanted to directly enter into treaties with foreign countries. For this, the Politburo accused him of nationalism. Did the West realize that there was no reason to accept then Ukraine and Belarus as members of the UN? I think so. It was a compromise in negotiations with Stalin. After the collapse of the USSR, Moscow again has some nuances with the UN. The question arises, who is the legal successor of the USSR? But we will talk about this another time. Subscribe and give us your likes.